It's time to talk about the future, and by future, I mean next season. We are continuing our series of expectations for players next year, and this time it's time to talk about the second line.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, I want to focus on the future, and I specifically mean Jets players and what I'm kind of expecting from them next season. And I talked a little bit about last one that we did of these, the top line, right? And you know, Connor, Ehlers, or I think it was Connor, Scheifele, and Velarde. Just because like Connor, obviously, for now is you know, probably going to be paired with Scheifele, especially if Ehlers gets traded. So maybe we'll avoid that, but, you know, given the history of this team and how that's traditionally gone, I'm not going to hold my breath. But this time I want to talk about the second line, and you're going to hear some names on there that are not necessarily locks for the second line, but based on how I could foresee Scott Arniel trying to run things next season, maybe we get a little ambitious with this one. Before we dive into our first player, Big Bad Brad Lambert, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Hockey GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NHL GM and managing your hockey franchise? Well, now you can with Ultimate Hockey GM. It's completely free, and Locked On listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On NHL in the game store. To download the game, just visit hockeygm.app or look it up on the App Store. Ultimate Hockey GM. Start your dynasty today. Now, like I said, this player, Brad Lambert, I have potentially starting on the second line. And yes, I think this is making many assumptions. The first is that Lambert has a good preseason and makes the Jets. And these are two relatively challenging things, not because Lambert has a lack of talent, but we're talking about a very big assignment and a huge jump in responsibility for a player who has one NHL game of experience. So let's just assume the absolute best case scenario, right? Lambert smashes it out of the park. He looks like he's NHL ready. Winnipeg is like, you know what? The only role for him is going to be on a skill line. Let's put him on the second line. And again, I think this is being very ambitious, but I kind of feel like given how the Jets roster is, what we've seen from Lambert in limited showings, the potential departure of Nikolai Ehlers, I just wonder if this might be where Brad ends up. And it could be wrong, right? We don't even know if he's going to play down the middle or out wide. I tend to lean towards him starting as a winger, but maybe the Jets surprise us, and, you know, assuming Monahan maybe departs in free agency, you could be looking at him as a guy who maybe they try down the middle on the second line, but I feel like that's also probably a little ambitious. So for Lambert, I think the biggest thing, right, is if he starts out as a wing, you know, talking about his ceiling and what he could do this upcoming season, I feel like a really successful rookie campaign, he hits the ground running. He gets maybe like 40 points, 45 points this season. He looks, you know, in the Calder conversation, but maybe doesn't quite reach those heights because he's going to have some really crazy competition this year. But I think the biggest thing is that you just want to see that he's comfortable at the NHL level. I think, you know, the Jets are going to have to be relatively patient with him because obviously that jump from, you know, the AHL to the NHL, it's not going to be as drastic as him jumping from like juniors or from Finland. But I think there's still going to be a pretty significant learning curve. And so with Lambert, I kind of want to set modest expectations. I feel like for me, the most realistic outcome is he starts off maybe on the third line, but the other part of me thinks, you know, the Jets may be loath to split up Lowry, Niederreiter, and, someone like Chibrikov or Appleton. So, where would Lambert naturally fit? And if you don't really want him on the fourth line, well, there's not many other places he could fit. I guess if Ehlers does depart and the Jets don't really get a winger in return, and you want to have maybe Connor and Namestnikov or Monahan with Perfetti, maybe you could try him with Ehlers or with Scheifele and Velarde in lieu of Ehlers up there on the first line. I feel like that's probably a little ambitious. You're going to have to find ways to insulate him, but also really bring out his talent, and it's a very tenuous balance. It's why I'm kind of struggling to figure out the best place for him on this team. I think that there's going to be folks who say it's going to be a pretty straightforward fit, but I don't know that that's really true. I think it's asking a lot of things to go right for him, and I think with Lambert, the most important thing is that the Jets are patient, right? He's going to make mistakes. He's going to have some rookie errors. I think he's going to have some real growing pains. And I think the Jets just need to take it game by game. And if he's really, really struggling and not really improving, you can kind of have that conversation and cross that bridge when it gets there. But, first, let's give him a shot to actually earn his stripes and see what he can do, right? We're not even to preseason yet. He's only had one NHL game under his belt. He did have an assist in said game, but expecting him to really hit the ground running is probably a little much. All that said, he is one of those kids that's really hardworking. He's very ambitious, and he's got a relentless work ethic. And I think we've seen him really grow in confidence at the pro level, which makes me think that for as much as there could be a learning curve, he may also adapt to the NHL speed faster than some other prospects. He's, kind of at a good age where if you get him into the pros now, he will be a little earlier than some of the other kids that have made it, but he's still at a good age where he's had several years of pro experience abroad and in North America, and maybe the jump is not going to be as hard for him as it is for some of the other kids. So color me cautiously optimistic. I feel like, again, a good year from him. You have a 40, 45 point season. I think that'd be amazing for him. If he somehow gets even more than that, we're eating pretty great for a first year rookie for a player of his talent. But again, it's going to depend on how much he plays, where they kind of envision his role. I kind of feel like the most natural fit is kind of on that second line spot where he's going to play 16-ish minutes a night. I think that's even still a little bit ambitious for, a prospect that we've yet to really see, even get serious NHL minutes. But assuming that, the Jets are going to have a need for a big time creator, transition expert, and perhaps playmaker in the top six, maybe that's where he'll end up, just because, Winnipeg's going to have a lot of needs. They're not going to have many players of his type. And I feel like Arneal has sort of signaled that he wants to lean on the kids more than we have in the past. And so, it's a tough balance. And I think for me, I could easily see it going a couple of different ways. I keep settling on him on that, that number 2 line, but maybe somehow he really smashes it out and he looks like a top liner. That's probably a ways off. I think it'd be crazy if that somehow happens, but it could even go the complete opposite direction and he ends up in the bottom 6. But given where the Jets are right now, given the roster needs and what Lambert is likely to accomplish in preseason, let's tentatively consider him somewhere in that middle 6, perhaps even second line territory. But let me know your predictions there. What are you thinking? Do you think he'll end up on the bottom 6? Do you think that there's a clear role in the top 6 for him? I continue to land on second line, but maybe y'all have a different impression. Drop your thoughts below or at my social medias at HL Living Loco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Now, I said Big Brad. We also have Big Bad Vlad. And I think if Monahan departs, Namestnikov, for me, makes the most sense to try and move up to the second line because he's played there and he's actually done a pretty reasonable job. He had, before Monahan came, relatively similar scoring rates to Sean's performance in Montreal, which is pretty crazy to think because Namestnikov, I think, has generally been pretty underappreciated during his time with the Jets. I think a lot of people like him, but even from my own perspective, there are moments where I don't realize just how good he's really been. So I want to talk about potential season expectations because he's a guy that's kind of played up and down the lineup. He's been as low as the fourth line and as high as the top six. So we'll talk about that in a quick moment. But before we go any further, just wanted to circle back and talk a little bit more about Ultimate Hockey GM. Locked On Jets fans, I want to take a moment to bring up one of our partners, Ultimate Hockey GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NHL GM and managing your franchise? Do you think you could run the Winnipeg Jets better than Cheveldayoff? Well, your dream could come true, and this game is most definitely for you. Manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the seasons, and lead the Jets to glory. Hire the right coaches and staff, trade players or draft picks, and navigate through free agency and the draft, all in a challenging and realistic game world. As a Winnipeg Jets fan, you know that there's no off-season. GMs are constantly making moves at every point of the year to improve their team's chances, and that's why I think you're going to love this game. Ultimate Hockey GM is completely free and playable offline, so you can play on the go as much as you want and when you want to. And best of all, Locked On Network listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get a head start in the game store. So make sure to check it out. To download the game, just visit hockeygm.app or look it up on the app stores. Ultimate Hockey GM. Start your dynasty today. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us as we're just chatting about some expectations for players this upcoming season, and this is one of the more complicated lines because it's the second line, and it's also the one that I have the most, I guess, confusion over who's actually going to be on this line. It's going to depend on free agency, on trades, and preseason. So it's really a wide open situation. I'm only talking about a couple of players that I could envision having roles, but it's entirely possible that my suggestions and expectations are way off base. We may be seeing a completely different lineup. And so take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, but let's assume that some of these guys might get a promotion. We're going to talk about Namestnikov and why I think he might be, if Monahan departs and we don't really pick up anyone who's going to center that line, maybe the best choice to anchor that unit in just one quick sec. Before we go too much further, though, I just wanted to chat to all of you Fox Sports or ESPN watchers. If you find yourself having to turn on the volume because there's too much shouting, I recommend making the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, Namestnikov for me has been a fairly underrated player throughout much of his Jets tenure. And I've kind of gone back and forth with him because the biggest thing with Namestnikov that I feel is that he's good, and he's also probably not on like a Stanley Cup contender, a second line center, right? I think that he's been versatile enough to play that role, but kind of in the sense that the Jets really haven't had anyone else who's been able to step up in that position until Monahan came along. And even Monahan had his drawbacks, right? Like the foot speed thing, definitely a bit of an issue. I like Monahan a lot. I think he's a very good player. I think the tough thing for Sean is that he's also just not fast enough to really be the guy that's going to help you in the postseason. I think that there were moments where he showed flashes against Colorado, but assuming that the Jets start facing fast teams in the playoffs again, I would have some concern that he'd be able to keep up, right? So assuming Monahan departs, assuming the Jets don't really have other centers that they're envisioning for that second line role, the only other guy who really fits the criteria that's not a young player that the Jets would kind of be taking a chance on would kind of be Vlad Namestnikov, who's actually served in this role before. It's one of the reasons I think he could actually be the answer temporarily, just because he's comfortable there. He's shown that he can do it. And you know what? He's actually not so bad. I know that he had like 35 or 40 points this past season. And so you're not expecting him to really smash it out of the park in terms of huge point totals. If he were to play with like Lambert and Perfetti, I kind of wonder if this trio would be a more defensively oriented group than you'd think. Like the Namestnikov and Perfetti have a noticeable defensive impact on the team. You've got Lambert or say Connor, one of those two. They're both going to have some defensive lapses. Connor and Lambert are probably not going to be guys that you want back checking or expecting to really be strong back checkers or man marking options or even zone or lane marking. You're not thinking they're going to do that, right? But what you are going to get out of them is scoring. But as more on the sense of, I would say, facilitators of play, Namestnikov and Perfetti are probably going to be asked to bear more of the two-way load. And so I kind of wonder what Namestnikov's performance might be on a line that's probably going to have more limited offense. Perfetti's game is kind of interesting because his defensive impact was probably one of his most notable traits last year, but then he had the stretch towards the end of the year where he scored like 3 or 4 goals in like 6 or 7 games, and you started to see more of that offensive confidence from him really grow out of some of the defensive actions he made. So I think it's a really interesting question. I think like the best case scenario possible is that Vlad has like a 45 to 50 point season. That's a lot, and I think it's probably more than I would expect from him. But he's also kind of hovered similarly in not like, I wouldn't say in that territory necessarily, but if you were to prorate it and gave him more minutes, he might not be that far off, right? Like in say 15 to 20 or like 15 to like 16 minutes a night, he's had somewhere in the 25 to 30 point range. A couple of years ago, actually in the year that the Jets almost made the Cup Finals, that was the year that he had a career high 44, and he was averaging like 17 minutes. So assuming that he was to see a big jump this upcoming year, maybe you'd actually see some pretty good performances from him. In like 14 and a half minutes last season, he had 37 points. So to me, it's not crazy that if you tick up the deployment to like 16 to 17 minutes, he might actually touch around 45 points or so, especially having, a talented young rookie or a goal scorer in either of Connor and Lambert, and perhaps a more confident Perfetti. Again, I think there's a lot of assumptions being made here. A, that Namestnikov would be the 2C option, or that he would even get the promotion, or B, that, the Jets don't bring back Monahan. So again, I think this is probably the line that I struggle with the most because I feel like it's the one that's going to be subject to the most changes. We know more combos, I would say, for the first line that work than we do for the second line, or perhaps better way to say it, more combos that don't work for the first line than the second line. So it's kind of a weird spot to be in, but my general feeling is like this is where a lot of young players and stuff could really earn a role over some of the established veterans. Again, it's really going to depend on how Arniel envisions this team playing next year and what roles he thinks some of the kids are likely to take. But if I have to rely on a veteran presence, I feel like Namestnikov in the 2C role might be the most current natural fit, barring any major moves. I do think the Jets are going to go after a center. I do think that's going to happen at some point. I don't know if it's going to be through a trade or free agency, but I can't say that I think they're comfortable with where the roster depth is at this stage. I know that they're talking about Kupari and some other guys like that, but like Rasmus hasn't really shown much to suggest he's going to be able to like be more than like a fourth liner, right? So barring that, who else would really be able to step up for the 2C role? You do kind of envision Lowry maybe taking that just through sheer deployment alone because he plays loads of minutes, but otherwise, I mean, there's not many skaters on this team unless you were to appoint one of the kids, and that's asking a lot of your young prospects. So I struggle with seeing anyone else right now who I think is going to fill that gap until the Jets find a more permanent solution. So if we're talking about stopgaps, to me, I look at it, I see Namestnikov as the best option. And I think if you ask him to play a little bit more, he'll actually reward you with some pretty good performances. But maybe I'll disagree. Drop your thoughts on that in the comments below or at my social medias, like I've mentioned earlier. I'd love to hear your thoughts, who you might think would make the most sense. I know some of you have talked about Brad Lambert in the 2C role. I think that's a little too much to start off with. Unless he has like a crazy preseason, I'm all for like playing the kids, and you've heard me talk about guys needing to have a leash in the past, but there's also a point at which I'm like, okay, that might just be a little too much risk though. So again, it's a balancing act, and I think you have to be very cautious, but I think this is one of those chances for this season where you could see some really interesting players and perhaps performances that people aren't thinking about from some guys who no one's really expecting. And I think Namestnikov is still flying a little bit under the radar, but maybe this year he gets an increase in responsibility and starts to spread his wings. But I've been talking on and off here in this conversation about Perfetti, because obviously he plays a role in this conversation as a center too. I know, right? He's a winger, but he might also play down the middle. Maybe Arniel thinks he's the 2C option, and if that's the case, it throws everything again all up in the air, and it starts to make my job even harder. Let's talk about what Perfetti's upcoming season might look like in just a moment. Before we go any further, though, thought it'd be worth shouting out our friends and partners at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or you get your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just wrapping up with some final thoughts. Obviously, Winnipeg has a lot of moving parts this offseason, probably more than they've had in some time. There's a lot of guys who might be expiring. We might be about to lose Ehlers in a trade. So there's opportunity for guys to move up and perhaps some players who might be moved out. And I think that's where I've really struggled to kind of nail down our second line deployments, right? There's some guys who I think might get a chance to really grow and actually develop into perhaps more important role players for this team. Namestnikov maybe gets the call again because he's a veteran. He's actually done well on the second line. And he can handle those minutes. Maybe Lambert, by virtue of there not really being other places, will get a shot there. The guy who I think is probably the most nailed down out of those three to play on the second line, though, is Perfetti. Whether Cole plays as a center or a winger, he's going to be on the second line. Arniel has kind of already made overtures to that effect. I think he's been pretty explicit about engaging the youth more. And I think that was almost a real call to Cole because he knew that Perfetti probably didn't love the way this past season went. And like Perfetti's agent at the start of this past season was kind of like, you know what? We had a conversation about, Cole's role with this team, and it's not what we were seeing with Bones. So I think in many respects, Arniel's going to refocus that and bring it back to what was originally promised, what was discussed. And I think we're going to see Perfetti really play a critical role on this team for a couple of reasons, right? For one thing, I think Cole's offensive game towards the end of the year started to really blossom more than it had in previous moments. And as he started to kind of find that scoring touch, he showed off that finishing ability that he was drafted for. He has a great sense of space and timing, and his shot is lethal. Like, his release is very powerful. He doesn't always make the most of it. I feel like at times he's been really hesitant, but towards the end of the season, he started whipping it, and he was scoring from some pretty funny angles. So a confident, more assertive Perfetti for me is a good thing. I think if he has a big year where he's playing more like 17 or 18 minutes a night, I could see him hitting 50 to 55 points. His prorated scoring rates, especially for how little he was playing, were among the highest scoring rates on the team outside of guys like Ehlers and Scheifele. I think he could be primed to have a really big increase in responsibility, assuming he stays healthy. And with his defensive commitment and the impact that he has in the two-way game, especially with his passing, his vision, his sense of timing, and his chemistry, I feel like he is a guy that might honestly get a real chance to take over that number 2C role. I don't know where Arniel envisions him, but I feel like, given how Scott is talking about being more progressive and being more aggressive, if you put him at the 2C role, it could really answer a lot of questions for Winnipeg's long-term future, right? It gives Lambert more time to develop as a forward at this level, and you know, Perfetti might just be really good at center. We haven't really seen him get a long shot there. And I know people will say, well, he's a smaller kid. And yeah, that's true. He's not the biggest player. But if you notice how he plays, he doesn't let that impact him. He's grinding in the corners. He's mixing it up. He'll be chippy and spar with guys just like the rest of them. And he doesn't really get bullied as much as people think he does. Even when he gets hit, the dude just kind of gets back up and really chugs along. I've seen veterans on this team honestly react with more, slowed reactions after getting hit hard than Perfetti. Like, he just seemingly keeps going. He's got a surprising engine and persistence to him that I think really goes under the radar. And because he's so smart, because he plays the game at a slightly slower skating pace, but a brain level that's higher than a lot of other guys, I think he might honestly thrive down the middle. And if you give him the right wing support, whether it's Namestnikov or Connor or Lambert or what have you, maybe that's how it's going to shake out. Maybe that's the best way to arrange it. What's kind of funny is, like, for as much as I've complained about not really knowing who the 2C is, it's almost like the Jets have tons of options and all of them carry some sort of inherent risk or drawback. But there's also some potential for some real growth if you see guys like Perfetti really start to take flight this upcoming season. So I think this year could really be the year that Perfetti starts to put his name on the radar for the rest of the league. Jets fans, a lot of them kind of already know that he's like legit and the real deal, but I think the rest of the league has yet to be given enough of a sample size to fear him the way that they should. He is really fun. I think he's a super dynamic player who perhaps doesn't always look like it, but the way that he thinks about space and stuff is phenomenal. He's a really intelligent player. He's a very hard worker. And I think that this season could be the one that really starts to cement him as a fan favorite, so long as he stays healthy. That has been an issue in past seasons. He's gotten hurt a couple of times. For as much as I say that he does take hits and gets back up, there are some moments where he has just gotten decked and not been able to recover. But that's kind of the risk that you run at this level, and I think everyone in some capacity has dealt with the same thing. So I'm just excited for him. I really want to see him get a chance to blossom this year. He's one of my favorite Jets young players and somebody that I continue to believe is going to be a critical guy down the road. I think we've not really scratched the surface of what he's capable of. I think we're starting to see moments where he's growing and showing what he can be. But I think we are, well, how should I say this? The best is yet to come with him. That's what I truly believe. I think we have yet to see what he can really do at this level. And all I can say is, if he really starts to hit his stride this year, the rest of the NHL better watch out. Perfetti is a champ. And again, I think he's one of the smartest players this team has ever drafted. And you also have a really hardworking, industrious work ethic to match with it. So, hey, sky could be the limit if he really finds his confidence. But let me know how you feel about all of these players. Do you think all of these guys are going to make the second line? Do you think their roles are going to be reduced? Who else would you sub in for them if not these choices? Drop your thoughts in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We will see you here next week for more offseason coverage and perhaps a recap of the potentially last game of the Stanley Cup Finals, all coming up next Monday. But like I said, that's all the time that we've got for tonight. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.